I'm a stepper, you're a stepper, she's a stepper, he's a stepper. Wouldn't you like to be a stepper too? So a little few thoughts on the stepper thing, but also on Proverbs chapter 11. Actually, it's the whole book of Proverbs and the whole stepper thing, which is really interesting to me because if you read the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous and 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, it is filled with Judeo-Christian language. Now, there is one sentence in there, I think it's in We Agnostics, but it may be in a different chapter, but it goes like this. Do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. This applies to other spiritual language you may find in this book or something like that. Now that's interesting. That's the place where it tells you that, you can choose your own higher power. However, apparently it can be anything except Jesus. So you can talk about God being your doorknob, and it can be the sunshine, it can be a little flower or a kitty cat, but it can't be Jesus. And the way that I know that is because I had a spiritual experience, a personal one with Jesus, when I was very new in 1975, and when I said his name, I was told I couldn't say that there. I was told that a couple of times, and I was told that again back in the 2000s when I went to meetings in a different location in the world. By then, the government had fully infiltrated, so I wasn't surprised, and maybe I was even using it because I was telling the story once again. They got even more upset that time. I think I was maybe even escorted to the door. But I use the word stepper now, and I notice when I say it in real life, people go, what? Like, they act like they don't know what I'm talking about. But it's very easy to know what I'm talking about because there are stepper programs for everything these days. But when the government began to infiltrate it, and I'm just guessing that was sometime in the 80s, although it could have been right from the very beginning. From what I'm starting to see, the way these MK Ultra programs work is that it could have been right from the very beginning, the plan, and it just was slowly implemented, you see. But they had that, when you look at that book, the language in that book is all Judeo-Christian. So we were back in the 70s, if you were members, and I was a very young member, but there were lots of them in Honolulu, Hawaii. And always, including right back then, when I was young, it was like suspicious, like how did all of we young people from all over the country, actually from all over the world, end up there? Why did we at that particular time in history decide, or by chance, end up there altogether? There was like more young people in those meetings there in Hawaii, even though we were not wealthy. It was not like we were taking wealthy vacations to Hawaii. That's not how we ended up there, but there we were. Lots and lots of young people who needed to address issues other than just straight up alcohol. Like I was there, had a big food issue, and lots of us had smoked weed, that's what we called it. And then there were some other kind of drug addicts. So at some point, not very long after 1975, that issue came up in AA meetings as well. So we went to NA meetings, even though I had never done any narcotics or any what were considered hard drugs at the time. And a lot of us spent the 80s, when most of the rest of the country were doing cocaine, were clean and sober. I know I was. So anyway, getting back to the God thing, the spiritual thing. That's the first place where I remember hearing about it. We were really into the spiritual thing instead of the religious thing. That's where it originated. But the government was getting involved, because somewhere in the early 80s, it became the mandated thing to go to AA meetings. Well, what did that do? It was no longer anonymous. That's a huge part of the stepper program. So no longer could you really adequately assess whether it was working or whether it wasn't working. But here's what I want to say. I want to say that, you see, there was this very fine line between the Judeo-Christian thing and moving on over into the real foundation of the Judeo-Christian thing, which was studying the scripture, which is the source of it. That's a really important path, part of the path of Judeo-Christian lifestyle, is studying the scripture. Yet, in AA, in the stepper program, you didn't have that. You weren't doing that. So what was the foundation? What was the foundation? You know what the foundation was for steppers? It was listening to people who had gained popularity by how many followers they had. So I'm going to give you some names. In Hawaii, it was people like Mary and Harry Lake, Noah, California Clancy. Those are just a few of the names of people who were followed. They aggregated large groups of people who followed them, and then that was the wisdom. GTFO. You know how much troublemaking went on as a result of new people listening to these people tell them what to do with their lives, the details of their lives, listened to their inventories, personal details of their inventories regarding their families and their best friends, and then these clowns would tell them what to do, but according to their interpretations of the steps, which, if you read the steps, had to do with spiritual concepts. What were those based on? See, there was no reference to the Bible. So this is, or any other sacred text, the Dhammapada. There was nobody studying the Dhammapada back then, as far as I know, and we're using that as a reference. No sacred texts, nothing of any substance. Now, on my travels, once in a while, I ran into somebody at a meeting who did not have a lot of popularity, who took me over to the side and said that to me. Yeah, they did. And that's the way that I became familiar with certain books, certain important books that then did give reference to this thing. But because of what I was hearing at meetings from these very popular people, some of them very charismatic, they were very funny, they made you laugh, and that's a very pleasurable thing. You know, I did. I paid some attention to it, and I ended up joining a religion, a very small religion, esoteric based, and studied. This religion said it was biblically referenced, but I would not know that for sure until I began to study scripture. I see now that it was. But did I mention the part yet where Jesus says, it is not what somebody puts in their mouth that defiles them, it is what comes out of their mouth. Now dig this. Can you imagine if somebody had outed AA on this way back when? Excuse me, if they had raised their hand and said, excuse me. My friend Brian and I used to have a joke about this in terms of sitting in an audience where there's somebody definitely an authority figure, and there's a little kid in the back raising their hand. It's like that Emperor's New Clothes story, right? Excuse me, what about this? What about Jesus saying that when you tell us about alcohol being the cause of the problem? Except that the big book says that that's not true. It says that it is not the cause. Excuse me, it says here it's not the cause. But at some point, once the government got their thing passed where it was going to be court mandated, I noticed a trend in all the meetings I went to, and that's when I moved back east, and it was especially prevalent there. But even in the meetings in Honolulu, it started to become more prevalent to stop making reference to the literature. It was only in the literature where it talked about this, that alcohol was not the problem. It was the root, that it was a spiritual thing. That's the mistake that I see with the people who are calling AA a cult. They're right about that because it's these personalities who began to rule it. But the spiritual aspect is something that I see not being addressed correctly. Do I think I have it correct? I do, actually. I think I have something to say about it that's not being said, which is what I just said, that Jesus said. And this is important because it's different than the Old Testament. The Old Testament does have some things to say about what to eat and what to drink, but that's a huge another issue. That's, for example, why the Freemasons are not Mormons. Mormons have very specific things to say about what to eat and what to drink, and about what makes you holy and what makes you not. Whereas the Freemasons don't have that. That's why they're not Mormon. And they don't have that guy who came and, found the new tablets and has the guy, special angel who tells them, Moroni tells them something else, and they have other issues. But the Freemasons are Old Testament, but New Testament as well. So at some point, because Bill was allowed to live there for a while, they thought maybe they were going to hook up and approve this new program that he had, except that it involved no drinking alcohol. And they said, sorry, we can't do it. We're not going to do it. So you got to pack up your bags and leave. And he went up north. And the thing I don't like about the history of AA, as it's told to most people when you're in there, is that they make it sound like it's some woo-woo miracle when he hooks up with the Oxford group. And when I lived in Westchester and I started to do research, I found out it was not some woo-woo thing. He already knew those people. When he makes that famous phone call, he was already familiar with the people in the Oxford group. And I began to find out that many of the traditions that looked like they were woo-woo inspired by God came from that group. So, I was a member of a subgroup in AA called the Beachcomber Spiritual Progress Traveling Group. And there was a charismatic character named Flowbird. And Flowbird had originally come from Virginia Beach, spent some time in California. She was very charismatic. It was the late 60s, early 70s. She was an older woman. She had very, very long hair, wore a bikini, bright red lipstick, but she hung out sort of like what we call hippies now. Hippies within the clean and sober community. And that's really the group that I got sober in. But I'm going to say about this, because it was a little bit different. Wasn't about the charismatic part, it was more about the spirit, and she smoked cigarettes, so she was like this, almost like this Buddhist Eastern philosophy aspect. She brought that in to this Judeo-Christian thing, and psychic phenomena, the woo-boo, yet she smoked chain smoked cigarettes like a chimney. It's very interesting. And we had a meeting that was not on the books. That's what it was. Usually held in people's homes. That's because it was not on the books. We didn't register the meeting. And this meeting was packed because, the tradition in the meeting was one that came from the Oxford group. And I didn't know this until a couple of years ago. The tradition in the Oxford group was you started off the meeting with the fifth step. And you did it to the person who sat across from you, meaning like you didn't tell your own fifth step. If you felt that somebody wasn't being completely honest, you took their inventory. That was a phrase we used socially with each other. You're taking somebody else's inventory. Yeah, that was not only allowed in the Oxford group, it was encouraged. Why? Because that was the seed that could get you drunk, was bottled up or denied resentment. So it was considered helpful to point out somebody else's resentment if they weren't being honest about it. And that came from the Oxford group. And that kind of energy was encouraged in this Beachcombers group, this rigorous honesty, to the point where probably people were hurt, because later on in the step, in addition to the rigorous honesty, was you weren't supposed to do it if it hurt the self or others. And human beings are human beings, and my experience is, and most other people's is, and it says this in the literature, is it takes most people longer to learn that part than it does to blurt out honestly somebody else's fault or even our own fault. It takes us longer to learn to have some discretion and to hold back, to be able to use wisdom. And that's why I mentioned in Proverbs, because it's in Proverbs that there's this concentration regarding wisdom. So who would you think in a stepper program, right after people are coming off of these drunks, they're recovering drunks, where are they going to get resources or inspiration from about wisdom, regarding wisdom? From their head, from their dreams? Come on. So that's why I'm saying we would have been better off diving into scripture than listening to Clancy or Mary Lake or Harry Lake, or who were some of the other big wigs in Honolulu. Other people following around Noah, or they would just talk about Clancy. People from California were much bigger. The island of Oahu was still pretty small. Our meetings were still pretty small. They would parrot what they heard Clancy say in California. And, that's how it was. But that's ridiculous now that you think about it. That's what was going on. Or it'd be better if they called it a Dhammapada, or Flowbird. Flowbird was very charismatic. But the people who followed Flowbird, they would follow them around and listen to what they said. They gathered followers. These were human beings who made mistakes. So it's been 15 minutes. It's a pretty long video. If I have to come back and make part 2, I will. And I'm going to read some of Proverbs, because I don't have a book handy here to do that with. So I'll read it from my phone or something, or I'll get that set up. Because I was astounded when I read, absolutely astounded. I thought to myself, man, I sure wish I had read this earlier in my lifetime.